You know, right. The podcast that uncovers the origin stories of some of the biggest names in sports, media, and entertainment. Nick Durst here, along with Joe Calabrese and Joe. We're excited for our guest today. We've had so many of his colleagues on with us, and now we finally get him to join us here today as well.
Yes, absolutely. You may have noticed he's worked for WFAN, CBS Sports Radio, ESPN New York, and he told you that he would come on the podcast once the New York Jets had a quarterback. So now that the New York Jets finally, after about 50 years, have a quarterback, he's on with us. We're happy. We have him on. Welcome, Peter Schwartz. Peter, good morning. Welcome to the show. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you guys for having me, and certainly thank you for your patience through this off-season saga with the Jets. But I'm glad we have a chance to talk now after everything has been wrapped up.
The dust has settled for now, so we're all set here. Looking forward to this conversation. So, Peter, much like you, I have about 5 or 6 jobs. Very difficult to balance everything. So, curious, what's your process like to manage your calendar, and how do you keep your family on track when they need you for something, and you're like, oh, well, I'm going to be at this job, and then I got to do this job. So, how do you balance everything with your hectic schedule?
Well, 5 or 6, I credit you for juggling that. I think I have a few more than 5 or 6. so sometimes I joke I probably have as many as 72, but it's challenging. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. I joke with people, but it's actually not too far off the truth that literally every time I wake up in the morning, I check my calendar and make sure I know where I'm working that day. If I'm working from home, what am I doing? Am I writing a story? Do I have an update shift? Am I doing a play-by-play? Like, I literally have to check, every morning. And obviously schedules are made up in advance. I hope as best as I can always to not miss any of my kids' games or not miss any family functions. So it's like a jigsaw puzzle. But you know what? After the 2 years we all went through of not having anything to do and then ultimately not having much to do, I welcome the opportunity to be busy and busy most days rather than not being busy at all.
So when did you want to work in media? When did you make that determination? And you attended Buffalo State University. How was it like being up there? How cold were the winters? How did you keep yourself active on campus in terms of what you did internships wise?
Well, it's funny you asked that. A lot of people ask me, like, when did you know you wanted to be a sportscaster, when you wanted to be in sports? And for me, it was, a really young age. I knew pretty quickly I was not very good at playing sports. I think my little league career speaks for that. I was not very athletically inclined, but I just always loved to watch sports. And I remember one night at home watching, I'm a diehard Yankees fan, but I remember watching a Mets game with my dad on television. And I remember turning to him and saying, this is what I would like to do one day. I'd like to talk on TV or talk on the radio like, these people are doing right now. And it really struck me too, like driving in the car and listening to games with him on the radio. And my mother wasn't, although I love my mother very much and she's very supportive of everything I do. It was always my father and I who had, conversations about this and going to games a lot together. So I knew when I was pretty young that I wanted to do this, and going to Buffalo State was just a tremendous experience for me and a great opportunity. I wanted to go away to college. I wanted to go to a city where I knew that they had sports, where I'd be able to see my favorite teams play periodically. I wanted to go to a school that had a good broadcasting department, and Buffalo State for me, checked all those boxes. At first they were dumb enough to accept me in. I wasn't the greatest student in the world, but I learned quickly, what it meant to have a really good education, and they gave me a great education, and the experience at the college radio station and being able to cover the local pro teams in town was just tremendous for me as a college student, giving me, my first taste of that opportunity, and I will always relish it. It's been way too long since I've been up there to visit. I'm hoping to get up there at some point this summer. It's been a long time since I've seen some friends from college, but I loved it up there. And somebody mentioned before how cold was it. I think it was you, Joe, who asked me how cold it was up there. And people ask me that all the time. And yes, it was cold in Buffalo. Yes, it snowed in Buffalo. Yes, it was windy in Buffalo. But to be honest with you, I never found it to be much different than growing up on Long Island. I mean, it's the Northeast. It's cold. It's the only time it really, to be honest with you, the only time it really affected me was when they had those lake effect snows, because Buffalo is obviously right off of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And I remember one time getting up at 8 in the morning to go to a class, and the class was probably, from my dorm to the building, was probably about the length of a football field. And I remember walking out that morning, and it really wasn't snowing that much. It's not like it was a blizzard, but it was blizzard-like conditions because it was a very light snow, but with the wind whipping around, I literally couldn't see 5 feet in front of me. That was really the only time it really ever bothered me. But for the most part, living in Buffalo for 4 years was absolutely awesome, and I'm really looking forward to getting back up there at some point.
That's great. What was your first job out of college?
My first job out of college was with something that probably either of you don't know what it is. Was something called Sports Phone.
I know that. Yeah, we know that. Call
It's
up
been
for
talked.
the scores.
Yeah. It came up on Twitter last couple of days, because the other day the Mets and the Reds game, Mets and Nationals, I think it was. I don't remember who the Mets were playing. I think it was Mets and Nationals. Howie Rose was talking about it because he actually worked for Sports Phone back in the day as well. A lot of local New York sportscasters back in the day, when I was younger, all got their start at Sports Phone. Basically, what it was a number you called up. You called up this number 976-1313, and just like you would hear a sports update on WFAN or on another sports radio station, you literally got a sports report on the telephone, and it was pre-recorded. During the day when nothing was going on, it was like every half an hour you went into the studio and redid the update. And then during games at night, if you worked the night shift, you updated those scores every 10 minutes. And it was wonderful experience. It was a great first job out of college. It gave me a chance to hone some skills doing updates, and we also had press credentials for all the teams in town, so I got to cover Yankee games and Met games and Islander games and Jets games, everything. Was just a great first job. I remember I was getting ready for a sports talk show at my college radio station. I was about to go into the studio, and I get a phone call at the radio station. They obviously didn't have a cell phone back then. I get a phone call from my mother. She had just read in Newsday, and she always looked in the want ads for me if she ever saw anything for jobs when I was home from college or whatever might be a fit. And she saw this ad for Sports Phone was looking for new employees. And I said, "Great, Mom, thanks. I'll call you back when I get back to my dorm tonight. I'll get the info." I did the show, and I got the info from my mother. The next day, I typed out everything, a cover letter, my resume, sent it off. I went on a job interview. They called me for a job interview when I was home for spring break. They said, "When can you start?" And I said, "Well, I still have to finish up college and graduate. So can you hold this job until like the end of May?" And they said, "Absolutely." And I went back to school for the last, I don't know, month or so, knowing that I had at least a part-time job after I had graduated college.
Very nice. That was
And,
the
and that
start.
did and that did eventually blossom into a full-time job with them. So it actually worked out great.
Yeah, you can't ask for much more than that before you graduate, knowing at least a little certainty what you're going to be doing. Because a lot of people, they graduate and they have to wait 6, 7, 12 months to get some work. So that was great. How did you ultimately end up getting the job with ESPN Radio in New York in 2001?
So that's an interesting story also. So, prior to working for them, I was doing some work at at WABC radio in New York. I was actually at that time working part-time in radio, and I was working full-time in another line of work, but still doing my sports radio and sports play-by-play stuff on the side while I was working full-time in another industry. And so yeah, there was an announcement that ESPN radio was going to start locally in New York, and it was the same people who ran WABC radio that they were going to run that radio station. And for WABC, I did sports updates for them. I did some talk shows. I did a football show for them. I did some baseball shows for them, and I actually was the radio play-by-play announcer for the New York, New Jersey Hitmen of the first incarnation of the XFL in 2001. That was on WABC. So when I found out that ESPN radio was going to start in New York, obviously I contacted the powers that be, and I was in the mix for a job, and that's how I wound up getting that job, and having to tell my boss at the other job I was doing that I was leaving, which didn't make them happy because I had to do it on very short notice because everything was coming together so quickly. But that was some fond memories of that. And actually this brings me back to, obviously it was the 9/11. So ESPN Radio New York went on the air on September 4th, 2001. And the first event that I covered for them was a U.S. Open, the U.S. Open tennis tournament. And, the Yankees were heading down a road towards the playoffs as well. And the first team that ESPN Radio New York 1050 signed on for a rights holder deal were the Islanders. So here I am, great job, great brand new full-time job. I'm a huge Islanders fan. We're going to have Islander games. I'm going to cover some Islander games. And they assigned me to cover the first few days of Islanders training camp in Lake Placid. So the day of September 10th, 2001, I had to go into the city to do my new orientation with the ABC people in Manhattan. So that was in the afternoon. Then at night, I went to go cover the Yankees game. I think they were supposed to play the Red Sox. Roger Clemens was pitching, and the game gets rained out. And the next morning, I know I'm driving up to Lake Placid, the morning of September 11th. And I get in my car early that morning. It was probably about 5:36 in the morning. And as dreary as the day before was, that morning, I remember driving up New York State Thruway towards Albany and then ultimately to Lake Placid, how beautiful of a day it was. And everyone that has their memories of 9/11 remembers just how beautiful and clear and nice of a day that was. And I was on the turnpike, the New York State Thruway, and just before Albany, and I was listening to a local radio station up there in the Albany area, and heard the news of a plane hitting one of the towers. And obviously at that time, nobody knew what was going on. It was, it was an accident. Maybe the pilot, got sick or had a medical issue. Nobody knew exactly what happened, but that's my memory of 9/11 was driving up to Islanders training camp in Albany. And I continue, then the second plane hit, but I kept going because at that moment, you couldn't turn around and go back. You couldn't get back into downstate New York. So I continued on to Lake Placid, checked into my hotel, and went to go watch the Islanders practice. And then this is the ultimate irony of the whole day. Here I was sitting in the 1980 arena, which was the site of arguably one of the greatest moments in American history, when the United States hockey team upset the Soviet Union on was arguably the worst day in American history, the morning of 9/11. So I was so excited to start that new job, and a week later everything was on hold because our world changed.
Yeah, that is a wild story, Peter, to hear that. When did you end up eventually being able to come home?
Oh, I was only up there for 2 or 3 days, as I recall. At that point, we were able to get back in the downstate. I remember that training camp was right after the Islanders had acquired Alexei Yashin from Ottawa, And
A lot of buzz back then for that
yeah,
Iowa team.
the Ottawa media came down from Canada to cover Islanders training camp. And that first morning after they arrived, their producers, their bosses, because obviously the sports world was on hold, they were alerted, drive to New York and go cover what's going on in New York. And these people from Ottawa that were there to cover Alexei Yashin drove to New York, obviously couldn't get anywhere near where they needed to go and had to turn around and come back. And that really, like, when people were calling me from ESPN radio, like, hey, because what wound up happening was WABC wound up simulcasting the news signal onto ESPN radio. So there was no ESPN radio for the first few days of the aftermath of 9/11, and they were calling me and they were trying to get a hold of me. I remember I didn't have a cell phone yet, and they're calling me trying to find out where I was because they wanted to use me as like a reporter on the streets of New York, and I'm like, I'm in Lake Placid, like this, I can't turn around and come back now. So I wound up being up there for 3 days. I didn't really get to do any work in terms of reporting from there because obviously the Islanders weren't anywhere near a priority as to what was going on in the world at that time. But it was a couple of days later, I wound up going home and, it was a week without sports. You remember the NFL canceled all the games that weekend. Baseball took a week off, and I was at Shea Stadium, the first major professional event in New York that took place the night that Piazza hit the home run against the Braves. And I remember sitting in the press box, and he comes up to the plate, and I said to the person next to me, we could be about to witness one of the great moments in New York sports history. And then Piazza hit the next pitch, seemingly landed in another planet when he hit that ball. So I remember being at that, but obviously that was just, a very, a lot of spectrum of emotions starting that job at ESPN Radio, because I was as excited as it was. It also came at a time that was very emotional for everybody, and it wound up, having a chance to cover the Yankees run, to the World Series that year, which was very emotional as well. But I've been very fortunate in all the years of doing this that I've had the chance to cover events like that.
Yeah, iconic moment for sure. Piazza's home run. You have a great run there with ESPN as they're, off the ground and running there and trying to make its mark in New York. Eventually, you end up with CBS Radio with WFAN in 2009. I feel like you've been on WFAN and CBS much longer than since 2009. I don't know how it feels for you, but how did that process come about for you to join the company?
What's interesting about that, and this is why I always tell, kids coming out of college and kids starting out in the business, like, just you're gonna run into pitfalls and you're gonna run into disappointments, and I remember starting out after my last year of college, I probably sent out a million resumes, tapes, whatever, and you get either no answer or you get like this real bland, sorry, we can't hire you letter. And even when I got started at Sports Phone, FAN was on the air already. And listen, you always want to try and get to your goals and objectives in life. And at that point, if you were a kid from New York and you were working in broadcasting, I mean, you want to try to get to the pinnacle of your business. And to me, at that moment, how great would it be to work at WFAN? And I was working, for lack of a better term, I was working in New York media, working at Sports Phone. I was doing some other things too. And I kept sending tapes and resumes to FAN. I finally did get a response from them. It was from Mark Chernoff, who was the program director, longtime program director at WFAN. And he wrote me back the best. I wish I still saved this. I don't have it anymore. I wish I had saved it. But he sent me back the best rejection letter that I've ever received from a job that I applied for. It was filled with constructive criticism. You sound great. Do this, work on that. And it really helped me. Like I feel like that letter was a turning point in my career, so to speak, because it wasn't just sorry, we're not hiring you, or these typical we've decided to move in a different direction. No, this was you actually knew he was listening to the tape that I sent in. Work on this, work on that, work on your inflection. And so 2009, I get a phone call from Eric Spitz at WFAN. They were looking for a fill-in part-time update anchor. I was looking for work at the time, and obviously there were a few years where I was ineligible to work at FAN because I was working at ESPN. But when that run came to an end, I was doing some other things, and FAN, out of the blue, one morning got a phone call from them, and the rest is history. And I'm glad to be there right now because it's been a lot of fun.
For you, what is your least favorite shift to work? I interned there, so I got to sense everything, but how the update anchor shifts go. I mean, the morning seems fun, but getting up at 2-3 o'clock, I don't know if that's that fun if you're doing that too consistently.
Yeah, I'll be honest. This may not seem like a very popular take by a lot of people who don't like getting up in the morning and don't like working late hours, but I am a morning person. So I can get up very easily to go to those morning shifts when I fill in on Boomer and Geo, or if I'm filling in on CBS Sports Radio with DA, or if I've had those early morning 880 shifts. I also don't mind the night shifts. I worked full-time overnight for ESPN Radio for a few years, and I didn't mind that at all because it didn't really conflict with any family stuff. I was still able to go to my kids' games. I can go out to dinner with my family and just take a nap and then go to work. So it worked out. Get up, get home in the morning, help my wife get the kids off to school, and then go back to sleep. So that worked out great. So I loved mornings. I didn't mind the evenings, and I certainly didn't mind the overnights. The one shift that I absolutely despise is the daytime shift, because it really, and this seems crazy because like why wouldn't you want to work like during normal business hours? And the day shift is basically like from noon, 1 o'clock until 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And to me, that's just like, that kills your whole day.
Yeah.
Because not only do you have to, does your shift start at 1 o'clock, but you have to get there a couple hours early to start writing and preparing for your update shift. And then you're working until 8:30 at night. And now you got to get home to Long Island from Manhattan. So it really, like, to me, that's the worst shift. I always joke, that's a single guy shift. That's not a shift for someone like myself who's married with 2 kids, family of 4, that, we like, you get home from school, you get home from work, and, go to the game, go out to dinner, go to the mall, like if you have that shift from noon or 1 to 8 or 9 at night, I mean, you have to have like nothing else going on in your life to have a shift like that. Because I try, if at all possible, not to ever accept that, because that to me kills your whole day.
Talk about the daytime shift at WFAN. Got to talk to you about a certain longtime daytime WFAN radio host. His name is Mike Francesa. What was it like having Francesa yell at you about the Jets?
You know what's funny about that? People to this day remind me about that they were listening that day or they were watching it on television. And I'm laughing only because, like, so every time somebody asks me that question, I just think about all the funny things that happened that day. The messages I was getting from people, my wife, working in her office, my wife's office had a cafeteria, lunchroom type thing where, like, a lot of the salespeople and people who take their breaks, they would go in there and the TV would be on, and 2 of the sales guys for her company were watching it, and they went over to her desk and they said, "Hey, Cheryl, you might want to check in with your husband. He just got the crap beaten out of him by Mike Francesa." And she called me. She's like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "I'm fine. I'm fine. Everything was good." And just like that, everybody's opinion right off the bat was that Mike was angry at me. Mike was screaming at me. He was not screaming at me. I came to confirm this, after the fact, because I had a great relationship with Mike. He was not angry at me. He was angry at the information that the Jets were giving me So he was screaming at the Jets through me. And here's the interesting part of that story. So at that moment, so this is circa 2010, 2010. Yeah, so it was a 2010. See, I just started covering the Jets, and my older son Bradley was just about 4 years old at that time. My younger son Jared had just been born the June of that year, right before the season started. So Jared was, in his crib sleeping at that point of the day. Bradley was in the den, right where I'm sitting right now, watching television. And so it was an off day for me. Like I wasn't out in Florham Park that day. I was off that day and home taking care of Bradley and Jared. And I said to Bradley, listen, WFAN wants me to go on and talk about the Jets. You want to watch Daddy on television? I'll put it on for you. So I turned on yes, and he's sitting here in this room watching it. And I remember it was a really nice day. I went outside in front of the house and I made the phone call to call Francesa outside. And we went through this whole thing. It was about Braylon Edwards and the drunk driving charge that he had. And the Jets had given out some really, really bad information the night before about everything. And Mike just lost it. He lost it on the Jets. Like, this ridiculous, because the Jets felt like they couldn't suspend him, where they couldn't suspend them, but they didn't have to play him. So there's this whole semantics argument. And Mike is telling me, I'm like, Mike, I understand. I'm just telling you what the Jets are saying. So Mike had this whole argument, but he was yelling at the Jets through me. Jets wound up calling me up because they heard this. They backtracked on a couple of things. And so I get off the phone with Francesa. I walk back in, and I remember Bradley is at the time. So this is like this is September of 2010. So he's all of 5 years old at the time. Daddy, why was that man yelling at you? Like he wasn't yelling. It sounded like he was yelling at you, and like he was not yelling at me. He was yelling at the Jets. And I remember like 2 weeks later, I think it was 2 weeks later, I was actually filling in for John Minko on a Sunday morning update shift. And so I was on with Mike on his Sunday morning NFL show. And so that shift would start like 6 a.m. through all the other shows. And then Mike's show, I guess, was at 9 o'clock that morning. And so it was about like 8:15 or so. I was getting ready for the 8:20 update. And I see Mike standing in the corner of the newsroom, not far from where my cubicle was. And I'm like, I have to go talk to him about this, because I'll go do the update. And I have to talk to him. Now, one thing about Mike was sometimes people didn't care for him, but he always took care of his staff. He always took care of his people. And every Sunday morning, and I knew this was happening because people would tell me, don't bring breakfast in on Sunday morning, because Mike brings in bagels from like a bagel place by his house on Long Island. I'm like, okay. So sure enough, this big giant bag of bagels he brought in that morning. So I went over like I was going to get a bagel for breakfast. And I said, Mike, I have to talk to you about what happened a couple of weeks ago. Sure. And I said, just want to make sure that, you and I are okay. Because, people have been talking about how, like, you were angry with me that day. And I didn't get the impression you were, no, I wasn't angry at you. I was yelling at the Jets. And I called Mike Tannenbaum, and, I said, they did you bad by giving you that bad information. And I don't know if I'm doing a really good impersonation of Mike, but this is the best I can do on.
It's good.
And I said, now you're in my inner circle here covering the Jets, and I have you on. People are going to connect the two of us now. So I just want to make sure you know that I had no problem with you. And Mike was very good to me. The 3 years I covered the Jets for FAN, and obviously with that came the fringe benefit of getting to go cover the Super Bowl for FAN every year too, and being on with Mike every day. And even to this day, I stay in touch with him every now and then. I shoot him a text to say hello, and he was always very nice to me and very appreciative of my work. But no, in no way, shape, or form was Mike yelling at me that day. He was yelling at the Jets through me.
Well, Mike wasn't the first person who's ever yelled at the Jets, and he won't be the last. Shoot the messenger, right? You're just doing your job.
Well, I would always yell at the Jets when I was sitting in my season tickets in section 339 at Giant Stadium, but no, not like he yelled at the Jets through me that day.
So you mentioned at the top, worked a lot of jobs, you 72 jobs. You've also worked play-by-play, and you're a public address announcer for the New York Cosmos and Long Island Ducks, some iconic independent New York brands and teams, and various other sports. So how did you get those opportunities? Was it a matter of you reaching out to them, wanting the extra work, and the extra broadcast opportunities, or did people who work over there, who represent those teams, reach out to you?
Well, with the Cosmos, and I missed that job. I was so excited when they came back in 2013, and I had a chance to work with them through their existence during their reboot. And obviously, it's disappointing that they had to stop playing again. But we don't know what's, there's pending lawsuits with that, so I don't have to get into that aspect of it. But knowing that they were coming back, I did reach out to them. I remember as a kid going to Cosmos games with my dad at Giant Stadium, and 70,000 people back in their heyday with, Canalia and Beckenbauer and Pele and all those great players that they brought over. My dad and I would go. It's funny sometimes. Hey Dad, you want to go to the Yankee game? Sometimes he'll say yes. Sometimes he was too tired from working and everything like that. But every time it was like, hey, you want to go to the Cosmos game? Like, oh, it's like he always wanted to go. It was something about, being at Giant Stadium with 70,000 people. It was just a unique event. And I loved going to Cosmos games, and it was great. And I always, will remember the championships that they won back in the day. So when I found out they were coming back, I'm like, boy, that would be great if I got to work for the team that, I grew up, loving to go to the games and rooting for them. And as it turns out, somebody I knew from another, from other part of the sports world, wound up getting a job with the Cosmos. And I reached out to him, and one thing led to another, and I got the job. The funny part about that was because of the people who owned the Cosmos, there was a company policy that they had to have, candidates for the job. And they were having an open practice one night in training camp. It was in training camp, or was an open tryout. I think it was an open practice. It was like a meet the team kind of thing. And they had like a fan fest at Hofstra where they were playing their home games. And the guy said to me, he goes, look, you're going to have to go through, I think you know where this is going, but there's another candidate for the job. And so you're going to split the announcements with him at the fan fest. And I said, okay. So do I have anything to worry about? And he goes, I can't come. It's just you have to show up and go through the rigmarole of the tryout. So I'm kind of like getting the gist of like, this is just like one of those things where like when a company posts a job, they have to interview X number of people to get the job. So I get to Hofstra Stadium that night with my family. That my wife takes the kids on the field to go do the activities, and they already had the other guy there doing the announcements that they had, for before it started. So I get upstairs and they say, okay, Peter, you're going to take over doing some of the announcements. So I go to sit down in the chair, and the other guy, who was a lot younger than me at the time, and he sits a couple of seats over to the left, and I read the first couple of announcements, and he looks at me, he goes, well, I could tell you've done this before. And I said, yeah, I have a little bit of experience. He goes, well, what have you done? And I started to read off all the things that I've done, like working at ESPN, and I currently work at FAN. And then the guy sits there and goes, well, I could see where this is going. And he got up and walked out.
Wow.
that was the end of that. And I wound up getting the job. But I kind of figured I had the job. I just had to go through the rigmarole of doing the announcements that night. But I loved it. And during my tenure with the Cosmos, they won 3 championships after their reboot, and I was the PA announcer for 2 of them, because 2 of the 3 they won at home, and one of them was in front of over 10,000 people at Hofstra Stadium, which was just absolutely phenomenal. And 2 times during those 7 years of doing the Cosmos games, I actually got to interview Pele, introduce Pele,
Wow.
who came to see some of the games. That was pretty remarkable. Was getting to introduce arguably the greatest athlete of all time. I mean, that may be debatable, to some people, but yeah, to get a chance to introduce Pelé to 10,000 people was pretty cool, and I miss that. That's one of the jobs I've had that I really miss. I wish they were still around.
Well, Peter, I definitely miss one of your other famous jobs, the New York Dragons. You
Oh,
have to come back and reboot because that was electric stuff. Garcia, tremendous legend in the Arena Football League. We'll see if anything happens there. You did a great article on that last year, I remember.
well,
And
let me just stop you for 1 second. I'm going to move the camera over this way, and if you can see in that case right there is a
yeah,
New York Dragons helmet. There's
wow.
some other Dragons artifacts in that helmet. That helmet was when my wife and I got married. That was a wedding gift from the
Very nice.
Dragons, signed by the whole team. That year, and I will say this about the Dragons, and I'll say this to anybody who would listen to me. In fact, the people that are bringing back the Arena Football League next year, and I've had conversations with them already about possibly having a role, whether there's a team in New York or not. My 8 years in the Arena Football League, not just the 8 years of doing play-by-play for the Dragons, but I also did work for the league. I did a radio show for the league on Sirius. I wrote for the league's website when there were Arena Bowls, neutral site Arena Bowls for 4 years. I did the national radio broadcast of the Arena Bowl, and did shows from Radio Row at the Arena Bowl. Those 8 years in the Arena Football League, hands down, the best job I've ever had in sports, the most enjoyment I've ever had in sports. And to this day, and the Dragons stopped and the league stopped after the 2008 season. It came back, but without the Dragons.
Yeah.
But those 8 years were so great to me in my career. So much fun, met so many great people. And like to this day, like I get emotional thinking about it, only because I miss it so much. It was the best job I've ever had, and I'm really hoping that next year, when the AFL does come back with the new ownership and the new management, that they figure out a way to get a team, if not at the Coliseum, somewhere in the New York metropolitan area, because that would really be a cool thing, is to get back involved with that.
Yeah, the barn was really rocking in the 2000s. So hopefully there's a team in the New York area, reboot it. And I think Joe and I agree. You'd be great for play-by-play, put me on the sideline. Fantastic stuff. So for you, Peter, though.
I was able to get a little.
As big as it
I was able to get a little taste of indoor football again a few years ago, because there's this other league called the National Arena League, and they had a team in New York a few years ago called the New York Streets, and they played in the Westchester County Center. And while it was wonderful to be involved with the sport again, and my color commentator was Will Holder, who played for the Dragons back in the day, it was not the same. It was not the same atmosphere. It was great to be involved in the sport, and I met some really great people that year with them, but it was not the same. And I just I hope that the Dragons can come back.
Tell us about how you're. Go ahead, Joe.
Do you ever think it's going to grow to the popularity that it did before? Because at one point you had John Bon Jovi and all these people owning the Philadelphia Soul. It was a national brand, a really distinct national brand. And I think a lot of people have always wanted a filler spot for the seasons and the months that the NFL is not playing. And I think the Arena Football League actually accomplished that for a brief period of time. Do you think that in a reboot it could ever get back to where it was?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that question. I could tell you that some of the iconic franchises from the Arena Football League are still spread out around the country in some of the other indoor football leagues. So I think for the AFL to be successful, they probably have to try and figure out a way to get some of those teams back involved with them, whether it's the Arizona Rattlers or the Orlando Predators down in Florida. I mean, I don't know how you can bring the AFL back without having those iconic franchises that were the Iowa Barnstormers, who became the New York Dragons. They're in the IFL and the other indoor football league. So I would hope that they're able to bring back some of the iconic franchises. As far as the popularity goes, there were different eras of the AFL. You had that first era where the teams were basically in smaller markets like Iowa, Orlando, places like that where they didn't have a lot of professional sports teams, and they were able to really, do very, very well in terms of attendance and popularity. And then the league started to grow, and the players' salaries started to go up. And then you had the time where the game was getting so big that some of the smaller markets couldn't catch up, and that's why Iowa wound up moving to Long Island to become the Dragons. And it was right after that, 2001, 2002, the league was still on that, cable deal with, with the Nashville network. And then all of a sudden, NBC gets involved because you started to have the NFL owners started to get involved with the sport, thinking at some point down the road, it could be like an official minor league. And I think there was some good and bad to that. I think the good was that they had an infusion of money and rich owners that were buying into the sport. I think also the bad part of that was that you had people that tried to change the sport a little bit too. John Elway didn't like the concept of Ironman football, and there was a point where the AFL changed. They went from Ironman to now playing 8-on-8. You had 8 offensive players and 8 defensive players, and I thought the beauty of the sport was that you had guys who played both ways. So, and it reached a peak of acceptance by people all over the country, and then it just it dipped down near the end. It was still on ESPN and big outlets like that. But I would hope that the most important thing that the new people do that run it is get that network exposure, get on a legitimate cable outreach. Even if it's their streaming involved in it too, they've got to get the exposure of the sport. And the biggest thing they have to do, and this is one thing that I was always pushing for when I worked for the Dragons, I think they'll have to do a better job this time around of educating fans who are new to the sport on the rules. We did something with the Dragons. They had me voice over it at the games, was teaching fans the rules. It was like AFL 101. So I'm hoping that when they come back, they teach people about the history of the game, the rules of the game. And listen, I always got tickets for friends and family who always wanted to go see a game, and they would ask me once for free tickets, and they would get them, and then they would go back over and over again, because once you got a taste of it and you saw it in person, TV was great, but once you saw it in the building, there was no turning back. You were basically hooked on it. It was a great sport, and I think I think it will do well if you have the right people backing it and you market it to the right people. I certainly think it can be a success, in certain markets, and then we'll see. They say they're going to have 16 teams next year, so it'll be interesting to see which 16 they wind up going to. Hopefully, one of them has a 516 area code attached to it.
We'll say the problem with the XFL reboot this time and the USFL is there's no New York team, or the USFL, there's a New York team that don't play in New York. So that's a conversation for another day. But Peter, for you, how does your prep work change between knowing you're going to be doing play-by-play for an event versus public address?
Well, public address it's different than play-by-play, because obviously you don't necessarily have to have all the background information on all the players. You get to the game an hour and a half before, you're given a script. Remember, most of the time doing public address, I mean, you're announcing just a player's name, number, and position. You're reading a spot for Joe's Hardware or Mary's Kitchen or whatever it might be at a minor league baseball game. But when you're doing play-by-play, I mean, it is a lot more background work, a lot of homework that goes into preparing for a broadcast. And if you're doing, even now, like if I'm doing a Riptide lacrosse game on the radio that's on a Saturday night, I'm basically spending, all week, looking at the roster, putting my spot charts together, watching the team that the Riptide are about to play, watching their game from the week before to get to know their players a little bit more. So play-by-play is there's a lot more background and homework that you have to do. PA is almost, it's almost a breeze. I'm not going to say it's a complete breeze because there's still challenges that come with it. But as far as like knowing the players, you really just have to pronounce the players' names correctly. I mean, that's the simple part of it. And then, it makes that fun. To me, the rush you get from doing public address is hearing the fans' reaction to you announcing. It was a little bit surreal for me a few weeks ago. I did my first Ducks game of the year. And Daniel Murphy, the former Met, is playing for the Ducks, and I'm introducing him in the starting lineup, and you hear I wait a second, you hear what was the reaction to the fans the way you announced that, and I stopped for a second after I announced Daniel Murphy's name because I wanted to make sure that I heard a little bit of the roar in the background, because here it is. Here's a guy that was a great Met for a long time and 2015 NLCS MVP, and here I am introducing him, at Fairfield Properties Ballpark in the Atlantic League, and I thought that was kind of cool. But the play-by-play is a completely different animal. I mean, you have to assume people are listening. They're trusting you to tell them exactly what's going on. And if the game is a blowout, you have to have something to talk about. So you have to know something about all the players, basically, during the course of the game, because you never know how the game is going to go. But to me, it's two completely different things to prepare for.
So I have a little bit of public address announcing experience myself. Nick, between the both of us, he's the one who does a lot of collegiate broadcasting, independent broadcasting. But for the College of Staten Island here, we've worked several dates together, mostly soccer stuff, but it's not so difficult, but sometimes you got to watch stumbling on over some names and stuff if you don't really know. And that's something that you really can't ultimately prepare for all the time. I guess it's a little bit easier for you, especially if you have familiarity with other players who play for those independent teams. But we want to get to your other jobs here before we start letting you go. Started writing for Barrett Sports Media, and Nick and I are fortunate that our podcast here has been featured a couple of times for BSN. Most recently, I think we did an episode with Noe Eagle, the son of the great Iron Eagle. He's working in California now. He's a good friend of Nick and I. So BSN did a write-up there, and I forgot who did it, but it was really, really good, and it was surprising for Nick and I. We also wrote for various lacrosse publications, Greater Long Island Media Group, sports anchor, Fox News headlines 24/7. So again, you juggle a lot of things over here. So primarily what I want to ask you is, how did the Barrett Sports Media opportunity come about? Did Jason approach you with that? And for these other jobs, again, who approached you to do them, and how do you juggle them in your life?
Well, it takes a lot of juggling. Sometimes people ask for your availability, and it's WFAN. You have to get your dates in that you're available for, and I always sometimes ask my boss, can I have an extra day or two? I'm just waiting to hear about what's going on, because you have other places that are asking you, when you could work. So sometimes it can be a little challenging, that you don't want to get yourself double booked on the same day for two events. And God knows that's happened to me, where you've had to try to talk yourself out of a shift, with a place you've already said you can work. So that's not good. But when you have, several jobs and none of them are full time, that's a little bit of a challenge, but you do the best you can. And we make it work. As far as the Barrett Sports Media job goes, I've been very lucky to work for them. I think it's coming up on a year now that I'm working for them. I can't remember the exact date that I started, but they did have an ad on social media. They were looking for writers, and I reached out to Jason, and he was obviously, aware of my career and my experience, and he thought it would be a good fit. So I get to do an article a week for them, focusing on sports media personality. And it's been enjoyable, because while it's nice to write about people I know in the New York market, what's really been cool about that job has been, connecting with sports media people around the country that I did not know before talking to them. So, doing a story about, a personality in Cleveland or in Los Angeles, or, in Chicago, executives around the country. That's the whole thing about this job is networking and getting to know people, because you never know, someone you're talking to in Chicago, next week they could be working in New York, and you could be working with them. So it's been kind of cool to connect with people all over the country. And tell people stories. And that's been the most enjoyable thing so far, was, to me, is getting to meet different people and connect with them, not just for the story, but then connecting on social media and, staying in touch with them. So I really enjoyed that part of it. I don't think I'm destined to be the next Bob Raceman or Andrew Marchand or anything like that, but I do like telling stories about, people who work in our medium.
How much of a thrill was it for you to be asked to throw out the first pitch for the Somerset Patriots?
That came out of left field, no pun intended. That really did. It's funny. Boomer and Gio, they've joked, and other people at FAN joked, like, how did that happen? Like, did you ask to do it? Like, you asked to throw out the first pitch. I mean, that's kind of pompous if somebody, asks or demands to throw out the first pitch. What had happened was the president of the Somerset Patriots had reached out to me the year before, inviting us to come out, my family and I, to come out to a game. And so that was the 2021 season, when they came back after the pandemic. And the schedule just didn't allow for us to get out there. We looked at dates, and, whether it was my work schedule, my wife's work schedule, the kids playing sports and stuff, there wasn't a date available. When the schedule came out last year, I looked at it. Now, I just give you a little background. My wife and my kids are Met fans, and I'm a Yankee fan. So whenever we go to these minor league games, we try to make plans to go, whether it's the Cyclones in Brooklyn or whatever. You try to go when both affiliates are playing. So a lot of times we go to Brooklyn, and Brooklyn is playing, Hudson Valley is the Yankees affiliate. If we're going to see, we were going to go see Somerset, I wanted to make sure we went when they were playing Binghamton,
right,
so that everybody is happy. So there was a night where it was a free night. My wife was on vacation. We didn't have anything going on that night. I'm like, oh, Somerset's playing Binghamton. Let's go to the game. So I reach out to hey, is it okay to get tickets for this night? My kids were excited because they were giving out baseball cards that night. So it was a perfect night to go. It was Yankees, it was Mets. It was a good giveaway. It's a nice ballpark in Somerset. And she said, sure, no problem. We're going to leave you 4 tickets. And then the next day, he sends me back another message saying, hey, how would you like to throw out one of the first pitches that night at the game? And I'm like, oh, how cool is that? I'm like, yeah, sure, no problem. And I start getting nervous. I go out, go for my glove, take the kids outside, and I'm loosening up. I'm getting ready, because last thing I want to do is embarrass myself, in front of 5,000 people. And I'm knowing, obviously, this is going to be a social media thing, and I'm warming up and everything, and we'll get, ready to go. It turns out I was one of 8 people who threw out the first pitch, but I was the last one. So I felt good that they saved me for last. And then they started teasing me on FAN when they found out about this. Like, are you going to throw it off the mound? And I wanted to throw it off the mound. That was the intent, to throw it off the mound. And then when I got to the ballpark, they said, you're going to throw it from just in front of the mound. And I'm like, you can't go on the mound. No, the groundskeeper won't let you go on the ground. And we're on the mound. So I kind of got like ridiculed. Like, why did you throw it off the mound? I'm like, they wouldn't let me.
yeah,
So I threw it in front. Had I thrown it, it was a little high, my pitch. I'm sure you guys saw the video of it. It was a little high. And what bothered me about it was that if they let me throw it off the mound, it would have been a perfect strike, because I would have been another 2 feet back. It would have dropped right to the catcher's glove over the plate. So I'm hoping that Somerset invites us back again this summer. I'd like to have another crack at it and throw a strike, and I'll try to stretch out my arm a little bit more and get a little more velocity on it.
I think you should have the Long Island Ducks should let you throw out the first pitch. You can introduce yourself, take the mic on the field, and you can make it some redemption. That'll work out. But
yeah, that would be interesting. The other cool thing about the Somerset was that I thought, obviously when you get asked to throw out the first pitch, you get to keep the ball. So I'm a big memorabilia collector. My kids are the same way now. So I figured, it'll be a New York. It'll be the whatever the AA league is. It'll be like the official baseball of that league. And I'll be like, oh, that'll be pretty cool. Put it in a case with the ticket stub from the game and everything. And we get out on the field that night, and there's a promotions guy from Somerset Patriots walking around with his bag, like a drawstring backpack. And he said, "Here's the ball you're going to be using for the first pitch." And I look at it, and it's just like a souvenir baseball. If I knew you were going to ask the question, I would have gotten the baseball to show it to you. It's in the other room, but it was just like a souvenir Somerset Patriots baseball with the logo on it. I'm like, oh, I really wanted like the league baseball. But then they said, turn the ball around. I turned the ball around, and it had Sparky Lyle's autograph on it. Sparky Lyle was
He's the manager.
obviously a Yankee great relief pitcher, who I loved as a kid growing up watching the Yankees. And he became the manager of the Somerset Patriots when they first started in the Atlantic League, the same league the Ducks were in, and he's still part of their management ownership group. So I'm like, you know what? That's a pretty cool souvenir to have. Is, yeah, it's not the actual ball they're using in the game, but like, I got Sparky, and I had to use that ball for the first pitch. And the last thing I want to do is throw one in the dirt or throw one over the catcher's head and ruin the autograph that was on there. So I was like, that got me a little petrified. So even though the pitch was high, thank God the catcher caught it, so it didn't ruin the autograph that was on there.
So Peter, that's an incredible story. We thank you for your time. Everything's been incredible so far. Last question here. What would you say in your life or your career has been your I'm right moment? We mean by that is a time or place where you wanted to pursue something. You asked somebody for advice. They said, don't do that. Awful idea. And you're like, you know what? I'm going to do it anyway. And ultimately, you'll see why it is that I'm right.
I'm going to give you two things if you can indulge me for just a moment. The first thing I would say is I was in high school, and I let it be known to everybody, like I was going to college to get into broadcasting. And there was a social studies teacher that I had in high school. Was great guy. We always had great sports discussions. And, come in the next day. Islanders played the night before. We'd have a great chat about it, or the baseball game, whatever. So during my senior year, senior of high school, 12th grade, I started letting everybody know, I'm going to Buffalo State. I'm going to major in broadcasting. I'm going to be a sportscaster one day. And so he pulls me aside one day before class and says, Peter, I just want to let you know, I think you're making a huge mistake doing this. And I said, why? He goes, my daughter tried to get into broadcasting years ago, and she failed miserably at it. And I don't want to see the same thing happen to you. I think you should look at something else for a living. And I'm saying to myself, wow, like I have a career goal. I have a dream that I want to do. And here it is, a teacher in my high school that I thought I had a great relationship with is trying to knock me down from my objective. So, fast forward in college, coming home from college on visits, I would go in, visit the high school, and he would say, how you doing? I'm like, oh, I'm working at my college radio station. I'm covering the Sabres. I'm covering the Bills. And, when I'm home on break, the Islanders give me a credential to come, and then I got the first job at Sports Phone. So I always relished the fact that I proved him wrong, because it always bothered me. Like, how could someone who is supposed to help mold you as a person in school then find out what you want to do with your life and just try to knock you down from doing it? And I carry that with me every single day. When someone tells you that you shouldn't do something, you can't do something, you don't listen to that, but you listen to yourself. You don't listen to anybody else. And I have this conversation with my kids. My wife and I both will have this conversation. Like, don't let anybody ruin your dream. And my older son plays high school football, and he wants to play in college. And he's got people around him in school that have said to him, you're never going to make it. You shouldn't do it. You should try to do something else. And I remind him of my story all the time. Like, don't let other people knock you down and deter from your dream. So that set the tone for me a long time ago. The other moment where I knew I was on the right track for things when I was doing the XFL in 2001. So many people in the sport, remember, I'm already established in the sports media at that point. So many people came up to me because they saw it, there were articles about it in the Daily News and things like that, that I was going to be doing play-by-play. And I had so many people come up to me and ridicule me for being involved with the XFL because it was owned by the WWF at the time, and it was going to be this crazy form of football and things like that. And my feeling was that, hey, this is going to be an opportunity to do play-by-play on a professional basis for 10 games on one of the biggest radio stations in the country in WABC. I'm like, and I think about it now, and it was just like jealousy. And when people mock you, my wife likes to say, people mock because they can't do it. So people were like mocking me for doing this because you didn't have the opportunity to do it. I did. So I remember right after the last game of the season, because the Hitmen didn't make the playoffs. So the weekend after the regular season ended, I'm covering a Yankees game. And I go into I go into the press box, and my seat is all the way to the left. And I have to pass the Yankee radio booth. And standing outside the Yankee radio booth is John Sterling, who I get along with great, always got along with him, really always nice to me and encouraging in my career. And he stops me before I get to my seat. And he says, "Hello, Peter, I want to talk to you about something." And I said, "What's the matter, John?" He goes, "I want to talk to you about your experience with the XFL this year." Because because sometimes the Hitmen led into the Yankee game, or the Yankee game was over and then the football game started. And he told me that he caught a couple of the games, because I just wanted to let you know you did a really good job, doing the play-by-play. And I said, "Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. It's nice to hear that after so many people ridiculed me." And he would say, like, "Why do people ridicule you?" And this, that, and the other thing, I shouldn't be involved. And the next words out of his mouth was an expletive. Blank them.
Yeah.
He said, back early in his career, he did the World Football League. He did all these other things. He goes, "You got 10 games of pro football experience. They're just jealous." Same thing that my wife and I would tell our kids. And that always stuck with me too, so I knew when you have someone like that was so encouraging and so nice to me, that I knew I was on the right path. So those would be the two moments for me in my career where it was kind of like an eye-opening thing.
Yeah, it definitely worked out, and the XFL launched things for you. Worked out for Matt Freskerg and some others, so nothing to be ashamed of. Peter, we thank you so much for your time. This has been a lot of fun, and that's going to do it here for this episode of You Know I'm Right. For our very special guest, Peter Schwartz, my co-host, Joe Calabrese, I'm Nick Durst, and this has been You Know I'm Right.